For those of you that don't know, my son, Aaron Parsow and Charles Parsow, and very proud of my sons, and we are just so delighted you're here. Thank you so very much.
All right, well, hello everyone. So this is very special and really an honor to be the one talking about my grandpa, who I barely knew. He died 30 years ago, roughly, and I was 5 or 6 years old. And this has been quite a journey learning about him and what he did. And this presentation has been really fun to put together, and it's been a kind of a multi-year process, really. The starting point was when Rick Engel told my mom, Margo, you should check out this book called Sons and Soldiers. Your dad's name is in the appendix, and it's about these Ritchie boys. And we knew that Grandpa was in World War II and that he was an intelligence or interrogation officer type of thing. And we saw that he had these medals and he had these Nazi daggers and other things. And it was just kind of like, oh well, I guess everyone who fought in World War II got some medals and had Nazi daggers that they brought back. But then once we started reading the book and we realized how important the Ritchie boys were, then it was like, okay, well, need to know more. And that prompted, because I figured there was more there with the medals and this stuff. So this box, this green metal case, was his, and inside of it was all this documentation that he kept, including stuff that we're going to go through today. And so what was left behind in this, and then an interview that he did that the Nebraska Jewish Historical Society did, like these oral histories. Actually, Bob Belgrade sent me the USB drive many years ago, and you're going to listen now as sort of the prelude to this, to my grandpa in his own voice telling the story. And we are in a synagogue, and I pray for a miracle that the sound goes smoothly, because earlier it was a bit choppy. So God, let this go well.
I'm here with Warner Frohman on July 18th, 1989. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to you. Maybe talk a little bit about your childhood and when you came here to Omaha.
I was born in Kaiserslautern, Germany, which was occupied by France until 1932. We left there because of Hitler and his pogroms against the Jews. You see, Kaiserslautern is quite a ways from Nuremberg and Munich. That's where the movement started. And it moved down to the west. The reason that we left is because the insistence of my mother's brothers and of my dad. He saw the thing coming. And it wasn't that bad yet, because when we left, all those Gentiles said, oh, they don't want anybody like you there. You're going to be all right. You don't have to worry about a thing. Mm-hmm. Well, you saw what happened. Right. They have to worry about a thing. We packed up what we could. You couldn't take anything out of there to amount to anything. Mm-hmm. And we came right here to Omaha in 1935. My mother had the 3 brothers here and one in Sioux City, which naturally had to help us come over and sign for us. My name was Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R. Some people said it's kind of hard to pronounce. What did we know? We were greenhorns. What the hell, So they changed it to Warner. My father had a brother in Danbury, Connecticut, and my father's name was F-R-O-M-M-A-N-N. But this guy in Connecticut spelled it F-R-O-H-M-A-N. The language barrier was very hard for me to begin with, because I knew hardly any English. But I had a teacher by the name of Helen Summer, who kept me every day after school and helped me learn the language. And this was very important to me. I had a very difficult time getting into the Army because of me being an alien. And they had to pull all kinds of strings. I had a friend here who, his name was I.B. Zimmern, who helped me get into the Army. So on August 8th, as I said, 1942, I went in. And being an alien, they put me in the medical corps in Camp Bartley, Texas. And then I went from there to Officer Candidate School in the Medical Corps. I was a medical administrative officer, which took care of hospitals and field hospitals and so on and so forth. And I was stationed in Fort Benning, Georgia. And I was the assistant detachment commander of the Fort Benning Hospital, which was one of the largest units in the United States. Then they sent me down to a regiment in Fort Benning, also called the 3rd Infantry Regiment, which was more or less a ceremonial unit before the war, but now it was a combat unit that was made like an example of what to have for these units that can move fast, faster than field hospitals and others, called Battalion 8 Stations. So then after I was there for 6 months, I was taken to Camp Ritchie, Maryland, after I graduated from OCS, which was a military intelligence training center in the United States. And I was there for 8 weeks, and I knew more about the German army than about the American when I got done, because everything was done in German. Everything was done that what they might think in German, and so on and so forth, which was a very interesting 2 months because of the type of work that I did and the way it was run. We never had a Sunday off. We worked 7 days a week. Once in a while you get a day off, but time was supposed to be nothing. It was something that was a luxury if you could find time to be by yourself or, whatever else it was. Then after I was done there, I was there, as I told you, 8 weeks. They flew me from Washington, D.C. to Naples, Italy, with intermediate stops at Newfoundland, Casablanca, and then Naples, Italy. And that's where the southern France invasion was planned, August the 8th, 1944. And I was in on that, in the planning of it. I was the only second lieutenant allowed in that blockhouse, as we called it, where the maps were on the wall, where you could actually see where we're going to land and what we're going to do. Well, anyway, we got loaded onto these boats and sat there in the Naples harbor with those big, like Goodyear blimps, so the planes couldn't fly in there, strafe and so on. We finally landed on southern France near Saint-Tropez, August the 8th, 1944. Then we made our drive straight from there through the Maginot Line. Maybe you heard of the Maginot Line. It was a defense line that was made out of concrete, and they thought nobody could get through it, but they went through it like, salt through a shaker. There was nothing to it. From then on, we went straight for Strasbourg, crossed the Vosges Mountains, which was something that was never done by any army, American or otherwise. Went to Strasbourg. From Strasbourg, we went to where we almost got captured because the German army sent down their elite ski troops, because this was in the winter when we crossed it. So we had to burn all of our equipment, our messages and our papers and you name it. But then we kept going, and we finally got into Germany. And the interesting thing is there are a lot of guys like myself who went back to their hometown that they were kicked out of. But me, I took our own town. In fact, they gave me charge of it for 1 day because it was on our map. In fact, this was done in France, where I got in on the briefing, where General George C. Marshall and other high generals were in there, and Kaiserslautern was right there on the map, and we never deviated from that map. Sometimes they change their mind, but they didn't in this case. It was quite a thrill, to go back to where they kicked you out of. I was a first lieutenant then, and I had a beautiful police dog. And I went to the place where I was born, where I lived. The people that lived there were a very nice family, and they were Catholics, very religious, and they were very good to us, and they tried to help us. And I told the boys to be sure that they get some food if there was some extra food, and not to bother them. But I did look for a couple of guys that I wanted to bother, but I couldn't find them.
It's too bad.
So that's too bad. That was their luck and my misfortune. The synagogue that we had in Kaiserslautern was one of the most beautiful in Germany. They completely raised it. It was long. And it was a gorgeous synagogue. My mother and the other ladies sat upstairs and the men downstairs. And it was very ornate. It had beautiful columns and a beautiful Torah case. And it was just wonderful. I had a sergeant and myself and the dog. I said, let's go how I used to go to school. So we went the route of going to school, which was quite a deal. Then I went, my dad had a business, and I went there, took some pictures naturally. But it was an emotional experience.
I'm sure.
Because I actually went there. It wasn't like I went there after the war. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it was just one of those things that happened, So from there, we pushed through Germany. We went to Munich, Augsburg. In Augsburg, I dictated the terms of the surrender by an American general. He said what he's going to do, and I told the crowd, the general, the 3-star general, this is what you're going to do. I was an
You were
interpreter.
right there.
Yeah, I was an interpreter for the general, and that was in Augsburg, and then from Augsburg to Munich, and then to Berchtesgaden. And that's where we stopped the war, so to say, for us. Then we went from there to Salzburg. And if you saw the Sound of Music, you saw that castle on top of the hill. That's where, down below, we had a prisoner of war camp. 5,000 or 6,000 of them, which were self-governed, so to say, with strictly supervision of myself as a commandant and some of our other people. They did their own laundry. They had their own kitchens. They had their own streets. They had a committee that would come every morning to get briefed, and they brief us what's going on, or that somebody was doing something that they shouldn't do. They had the guys in there that snitched on them because that's what we wanted them to do. Now, my job during the war was combat intelligence. That was interrogating prisoners that patrols went out to get, to find out where their status is, where they're from, where they're going, how many are there, and what's the morale. You could tell that by the way they talked and everything. We used different methods for interrogation, nothing physical, all of it mental. But that was my job. I was with the 3rd Infantry Division, which is one of the oldest divisions in the United States Army, and they were in World War I. We processed thousands and thousands of prisoners, after the war was over. We went to Bad Wildungen, where we had a processing center. They never wanted to go where the Russians were. They wanted to go where the American or the French. Never wanted to go where the Russians were. But that didn't make any difference to us. If that's where they were born or that's where they lived, we repatriated them to their homeland, whether they liked it or not. Then when it came to the interrogation and to the sorting out, I got to the point where there were so many prisoners that I didn't talk to anybody below the rank of major. We found Japanese diplomats. We found a lot of 3- and 4-star generals hiding out under the cloak of being sick. So we had to clean that deal up. And we got a lot of publicity because we weeded out those guys. The war was an experience because thank God I got home and they won peace. I was proud to serve my country because America took me when nobody wanted me, as far as I know. And I felt it was my duty, without any baloney, to get into the Army, to show my thanks and to show my responsibility, which I did. It was hard on my parents, but they understood that I had to go. It would have been, probably could have got deferred, probably could have never even went because we worked so hard to get in. And when we were in Salzburg, we didn't know what was going to happen, whether they were going to ship us to the South Pacific. But we were lucky. We got home. We came to Boston. That's where we landed. And the chapter is done.
This is a document from Germany that has the original reference to. This is actually the only reference to Leopold. It does say Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R, and then Frohman with the 2 M's and the 2 N's that you would have heard him talk about in the audio. And this is him at 13 years old when he left Germany. here's the immigration papers that he kept, admitted into New York in March of 1935. They left Stuttgart, Germany about 5 weeks before that, in January 1935. So these are Warner's parents, Carrie Rosenstock and Adolf Frohman. One of the things that's really amazing about this is all these documents, for the most part, it's because my grandpa knew that his military service was, nerve-wracking to his parents, and so he sent them photos and things. And so a lot of what you'll see through this is because of what he sent back to his parents. So, and it's my grandma Carrie, great-grandma Carrie's brothers that you would have heard. They were here in sort of the Midwest in the cattle business, and so they were able to sponsor my grandpa and his parents to come here. The other thing that's sort of interesting is Adolf didn't change his name, which, I'm sure was tough being an immigrant. He was a lot older and had a difficult time assimilating, but my great-grandma Carrie did learn English quite well, so that made it easier on her. Another thing, so for those of you that have read Sons and Soldiers, this book about the Ritchie Boys, one of the things that was referenced in it is about how a lot of German Jews didn't believe that the Nazis would ever come after them because they were veterans of World War I. And that's why a lot of them didn't leave. And going through all these documents, my grandpa actually kept what looks to be military paperwork, because it talks about Berserk commandos from Kaiserslautern, and it's dated like 1915 from my great-grandpa Adolf. And so that would have applied to them and made it much more difficult to leave. So back in July of 1941, my grandpa got this letter in honor of his fundraising that he did. He got 383 young people to donate $860 to the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And what the interesting thing is, in this kind of second paragraph, it says, "You will be interested to know that with only $100, the Joint Distribution Committee can support 100 refugees for 1 week in unoccupied France, or feed 250 men and women for 10 days in Shanghai." So $860 was very helpful to these people. So in 1942, my grandpa finally enlisted, and you would have heard again in the audio that it was a challenge for him to get into the military, but he finally did. And because he was a foreigner, he was put into the Medical Administrative Corps, and he was sent to Camp Barkley, Texas. So this is presumably him showing up to basic training at Camp Barkley in 1942, and he says, "To the best folks in the world, Warner." 21 years old. So at Camp Barkley, my grandpa was in charge of sending ambulances to the hospitals as part of the Medical Administrative Corps. And so here's a picture of Private Frohman at Camp Barkley. And in this newspaper clipping that he kept, it was sort of a comedy sketch that he was involved in where, and I have the actual thing here. So Private Boyles and Private Frohman, section leader of this medical training battalion, both had surprises in store for them on a recent battalion bivouac. Frohman was in charge of sending ambulances on their way to hospitals, but during the maneuvers, there was one patient short, so Frohman was bandaged from right to left and top to toe. Lieutenant Boyles then walked up and ordered, "Evacuate that patient at once." Frohman was promptly lifted into an ambulance and whisked away. A moment later, the lieutenant shouted, "Where's Frohman? I want to see him at once." But the patient was already out of hearing range. My grandpa became a U.S. citizen through the Army, and here's the naturalization paperwork from 1943. His parents also became naturalized, one before Warner's service and one after. So this is the paperwork that my grandpa kept referencing his transfer from Fort Benning, Georgia to the MITC Military Intelligence Training Camp at Camp Ritchie, Maryland. And you can see the blue ink kind of pointing at his name. Those were his orders to transfer. That would have been in early 1944. And this is a postcard that he sent to his parents. And at the time, he was a second lieutenant. And you can see he wrote Lake kind of there on the side, and there's a building on the right-hand side last month, the director of the Camp Ritchie Museum was giving a presentation, and she was referencing how that building on the right that you can see next to the lake, it was an officers club. And so she said, that my grandpa would have likely been there when he did have time off, which was very rare. That was one of the things that, we worked 7 days a week. And here's the certificate of his graduation from Camp Ritchie, dated the 13th of July, 1944. And there's the 19th class that went through the training program. It was an 8-week program, very intensive. And about a week later, on July 20th, he was flown from Washington, D.C. to Naples, Italy. And he had intervening stops in Newfoundland, the Azores, Casablanca, Algiers, and then landed in Naples. And boarded the USS Thurston on August 8th. And you can see one of the things, I think it was pretty common for soldiers to have mementos, on currency from the different places they went. So one of the other things that was in the case is like, francs and lira and all the other currency that he interacted with during his wartime efforts. And so he got to Naples, and this is the top secret orders that he kept, dated August 3rd, for his transfer to the 3rd Infantry Division to land at Saint-Tropez as part of Operation Dragoon. And that was Southern D-Day, and that occurred on August 15th. So basically he found out August 3rd he was going to be loaded up. And one of the things you didn't get to hear from the audio is that he was one of the only lieutenants in the room in the blockhouse where they were actually planning out the invasion of southern France. And the bottom, this order is signed by O'Daniel commanding. That's Iron Mike O'Daniel, whose name you'll hear again in a bit. So this is a souvenir newspaper that my grandpa sent back to his parents. And at the top, you can see the red writing, but it says, "Here you can read what I've been doing the past 61 days. I landed at 8:40 a.m., August 15th, 1944, D-Day. Now you know why I can't write too often and to everybody. This is a complete story. Please save this paper." And you can see that he highlighted that he was with the 3rd Division that went through France. And one thing too, the 3rd Division of the Army was the most decorated division. Like Audie Murphy was in it. They won the most Congressional Medal of Honor awards of any division of the Army for World War II. And this officer's notepad, these are his notes that he kept. And that's sort of the other main source of information besides these documents and that interview that he did that chronicles from basically landing on D-Day to the end of the war in Salzburg at VE Day. And one of the things that the Ritchie Museum director was talking about is that there were several Ritchie boys who did die because it wasn't just like they were, protected in the far, rear of the service. They were on the front lines and they were at risk. And you can see, so my grandpa landed at 8 a.m. on Saint-Tropez Beach. And then it says a few lines down below, "Missed stepping on mine, 9:30. So he could have been dead 2 hours into this, which is just unbelievable to me. And there's several instances of him saying, heavy shelling, heavy artillery, and the like. And then one of the things that you didn't get to hear about is he and the Army, when they were going from France into Germany, they had to go through the Vosges Mountains. And this was a very significant event because no army had ever done this. And also it was heavy snow, and there was a Nazi elite ski troop that had come down and ambushed them essentially, and they had to burn all their papers and whatnot. And what's interesting too is in the records here, he wasn't writing very much between August of 1944, and then the next reference is in November, late November. So I think he was, I don't know exactly if he had to get a new one of these or if he, but there's not a lot that was left because they may have had to burn it all. He was promoted to first lieutenant while he was in France. That was in December of 1944. Here he kept the orders that were, by command of General Eisenhower, being promoted. He underlined his name there. In March of 1945, he arrived in his hometown, Kaiserslautern, and he was a first lieutenant. And he wrote that he had a prisoner of war cage located across from where the synagogue used to be. And the house that he grew up in was bombed, heavily damaged. First 3 rooms not livable. Some of their family friends, the Gentiles, he referred to them, by the way, in the interview as very from, which I had to Google, and it's actually a Yiddish word that means religious, which is kind of funny. They were Catholic, very from. And he checked the entire town, and one of the things he said is that he did go looking for a few people, and he didn't find them, and that was their luck and his misfortune. But they saw 20,000 prisoners of war just a few hundred yards from the cemetery. And he wrote a letter to his parents that ended up getting published in the newspaper, and that's this clipping here. And it says, "From a soldier, Germany. As I stood this morning in Kaiserslautern, the city of my birth and happy childhood, my thoughts turned to you, my dearest parents, and with deep humility and a full appreciation for our beloved adopted country, America. We drove by the Hotel Schwan, which is completely destroyed, as is everything else in the neighborhood, and then to the site of the synagogue. I say site advisedly because there is not a single stone left of our beautiful synagogue. The barbarians razed it, leveled off the ground, and under it built an air raid shelter. Then we drove through the street on which our house still stands. It had been hit on December 28th. The front rooms are completely destroyed. I had my reasons for not looking up too many people in the neighborhood, but I did see 2 families who are broken old people. The other family was bombed out and moved to the cloister, and they too are extremely old. Then we drove through the park, which stands unchanged, almost as a symbol of nature's defiance. Dad, your office building still stands, but everything around it is bombed out. The butcher shop, the post office, and the opera. I do appreciate this act of God that sent my division into the town that kicked us out. My big purpose and aim at this point is to help prevent any future necessity for my children or anyone else's children to come to Europe in uniform again." So this is a clipping of the 20,000 prisoners of war in Kaiserslautern. So they did capture a significant amount of Nazis there. So he sent this back to his parents. I think this author from the newspaper, Houston Boyle, has had a thing for my grandpa because he was referenced several times in some of the articles. And in the bottom left of this, it's the article is titled "Handling Prisoners of War from WACs to Generals is a Big Job." And then in the bottom left, my grandpa cited as saying, "The sooner we get rid of the officers, the better, as they are a burden," said First Lieutenant Warner B. Frohman, Omaha, Nebraska, born in Kaiserslautern, Germany, recently helped to reconquer the town from his old home and found his home still intact and set up a temporary prisoner of war cage in his backyard. This is another time that he was cited, this time about radio permits, fast pickup of prisoner of war info. "Something new in Kraut interrogation has been inaugurated by First Lieutenant Warner B. Frohman, Omaha, Nebraska, of the 15th Infantry Interrogation Team. A German Obergefreiter was scared by our artillery into surrendering to a private from Michigan and was hauled into a battalion CP. It was decided to try a new slant. Let the lieutenant at regimental headquarters question this latest prisoner of war stockade prospect by radio. So a private from New York City and a battalion radio operator contacted the captain on duty in the regimental war room, and Lieutenant Frohman was brought to the set. While staff officers and liaison officers formed an audience, the interrogating officer sat with a map board on his lap, marking in information as the German officer gave it to him over the radio." He also was very photogenic, wouldn't you say? It's him on the right with a cane. So the 3rd Division was the division that captured Nuremberg. So the 3rd Division was like all through southern France into the Rhineland. My grandpa was in a war room with George C. Marshall earlier on in France when he pointed at a map, and the map showed that they'd be going through Kaiserslautern. And one of the things that's very common in war is that plans change. But in this case, they never deviated from that plan. And so it was very special that Grandpa got to actually follow through with that as part of the war. And he was very proud of the fact, and it was a unique fact, that it wasn't that he went back to his home after the war. it was that his mission was to retake his hometown. And so that was pretty amazing. And so the Third Army also went into Nuremberg as part of this, and they were there. This is a picture that I think he took just because it's a little fakakta, but before the ceremony, that's the swastika which was blown up. I sent you a little piece of it. That's there's 2 or 3 things that he references in these letters that are missing. One is the piece of the swastika that was above Nuremberg Stadium where Hitler had all those rallies. But the Third Army, and you'll see it in this next picture, before they blew it up, they raised the American flag over it. And yeah, there's some video footage of this I've seen. It's rather stunning. Nuremberg Stadium after the 3rd Division took over. And so, that was pretty special to him, and it's too bad we don't have that piece, but maybe it's better that it's gone. So one of the other things that he talked about in the interview that's corroborated by his notes is that he dictated the terms of surrender on behalf of Iron Mike O'Daniel, whose picture is there on the top, against this Brigadier General Nazi Gustav Fane. So you can see there that they entered Augsburg in late April 1945, captured 3,700 prisoners of war in one night and day, captured Brigadier General Fane, interpreted for Iron Mike in his trailer, captured his entire staff, 10 officers. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that my grandpa, I think he had access to a plane, a Cub. You can see it referenced a little bit down, and they took off from the Autobahn, but that's how they went around all of these kind of faraway places to do all this interrogation. One of the things that he said in the interview is that towards the end of the war, he wasn't interrogating anyone below the rank of major. And the next page here is just something I found kind of interesting. He kept this Daily News extra. Hitler finally, completely, officially dead. Adolf Hitler is dead. Admiral Donitz, former commander-in-chief of the German Navy, announced the Führer's death over what is left of the German radio network. Hitler, he said, died at the battle post at the Reichschancellery in Berlin. No details of the Nazi leader's death were released, but it is expected that Goebbels' propaganda machine will furnish the world with glowing account shortly. And then there's another reference here to talking to Kesselring's peace party. So at the end of the war, this was May 4th, so 3 days after Hitler's death was announced, the German military was collapsing, and all the generals were trying to negotiate, surrender for themselves. And Kesselring was one of the general field marshals of the Air Force underneath Goring, who you'll come to know a little bit about in a minute. But my grandpa was, talking to a peace party with them. And then VE Day, a few days later, May 8th, 1945. And here in his notes, he said, went to dinner and general's party at a castle where Hitler used to entertain all the diplomats. Very beautiful grounds and building. He was with the army that also went through Berchtesgaden, which is where Goring and Hitler had their own places and air raid shelters, and unbelievable money spent on furnishings and air raid shelters. Goring's butler showed us around his house, very badly damaged, drank Goring's liquor and champagne. And then on VE Day, my grandpa wrote his parents another letter. This one is on Goring's personal stationery, which has the Goring coat of arms in the top left. And I never thought to do this, but the director of the Ritchie Museum, she's seen a lot of things, because there's like 3,000 of these European Jewish Ritchie boys, but she hasn't seen a lot of Goring stuff. And so she found it pretty interesting. And the first thing she did was to verify it. She took it and she held it up, and there was a watermark. And she was like, the stamp, you could take the stamp and put it on anything, but the watermark is very significant. So that was pretty cool to find out. And then I'll read you what that letter says, because it's also pretty amazing. Today is the day we have all been waiting for. We have a lot to be thankful for, and believe me, I know somebody took care of me since I left you in the States. It's very hard for me to realize that it's all over, and I guess it will take me a little while to get used to a lot of things. I know the end of the war here takes many worries from you, which to me is one of the most important things. I know that the past few months were not easy on your nerves, but now it's over. It's a great feeling, and I am very thankful to be able to write this letter today. The paper I'm writing to you on is the stationery Hermann Goering used. I saw Hitler's house in Berchtesgaden, and it's unbelievable how he had everything fixed. Göring's butler showed us around Herman's house, but there isn't too much left since our Air Corps did an excellent job. The country around here is just like you left, and as you see in movies or in the pictures. The hideout is very high up, and a Jeep even has a hard time climbing it. At Göring's house, there was enough champagne and other drinks so that he really furnished us handsomely for our VE day. We only had the best. I have his personal whiskey glass and one of his cups. Those are the other two things that no longer are in our possession. Too fragile to make it back. Hitler's house is completely destroyed, and it's too bad he wasn't in it when the bombs did hit, because then I'd be convinced that he is dead. By the way, my division took Berchtesgaden. Time will tell what happens next. Right now, I hope things slow down so we can all get a good rest. We are all nervous and tired since we really have been going strong. Right now, we have a very nice setup in a resort hotel. Lights, water, hot and cold, radio, and even white sheets. Yes, this is not bad at all. Take good care of yourselves. Much love, your son, Warner. I mean, it's like he was 23 years old. It's just unbelievable, right? So here's the letter. So here's Salzburg. They set up a prisoner of war camp underneath this castle, which is the castle from Sound of Music, and he talked about that in the interview. So in Bad Gastein, this was in Austria, after the war, and they were dismantling the army, there was a lot of, you'll read it in a second, actually. So, but this was where they stayed. You see he marked a little X next to his room. I think that's the Hotel Bismarck. Yeah, beautiful place, perfect setup. That's the headquarters in Bad Gastein, June of 1945. So this is another article by Houston Boyles, and this is kind of a fun read. Until this week, nothing ever happened much in the Grand Hotel in unbombed Bad Gastein, Austria. With Kraut Brass, Shishi Berlin Society, notorious Gestapo bigwigs, kings, oriental diplomats, opera stars, scientists, and movie queens getting away from it all in this famed mineral bath resort. The startling impact of the Lost War is now overtaking them in their ivory castles. 3rd Infantry Division heat is on, and some changes have been made. 7 Kraut generals, including 2 4-stars, General Oberst Walter Weiss, commanding General Army Group North, and General Oberst Erhard Raus, and Krauts of all grades were picked up during a week of swift checkup and wholesale arrest by military intelligence personnel commanded by 3rd Division Lieutenant Werner B. Frohman, German-born dogface from Omaha, Nebraska. So these, I did translate this. These are sick leave papers for this SS police chief, George Ebrecht. And you can see like Heinrich Himmler's wet ink signature at the bottom of this, which apparently there are a lot of Himmler signed documents that the Ritchie Boys collected. And then this is another thing. It's signed by a doctor. I didn't go to the trouble of translating this, but it's signed from Bad Gastein in June of 1945. It's signed by a doctor, so I assume that these are also sick leave papers of some Nazi. So in Bad Kissingen, 1945, my grandpa was meeting with the provost marshal, and you can see he drew a little arrow on himself there in the left-hand side of that with all those prisoners of war. And then here again, he sent another thing, another photo to his parents, and he put an arrow over himself, and he said on the back of it, marching 900 prisoners of war to a collecting point. Don't worry, see all the guards in my Jeep. So just some more prisoners. He took a few pictures with this liberated Mercedes. He and the colonel, an adjutant, and then an S3, which I think is like a captain or a major. But you can see he's very happy there, and he has a pipe in his hand. And there's another picture with him. It's very faded, though, of him with this pipe that I think he might have used as a prop in his interrogations. But big smile. So some more airplanes. These are German planes that they used in Austria. I flew many a mile in them. So this is another interesting story that has some backstory to it. So Otto Skorzeny was identified by this guy in this picture. That's Paul Krauss, who was also a German immigrant in Omaha. And apparently there was an article that came out about the capture of Otto Skorzeny, who was a really infamous SS commando, basically Hitler's personal henchman. This guy was like 6'4", had dueling scars across his face, so he was pretty easy to identify and like the perfect villain in your mind. And Otto Skorzeny was famous pretty much for three things. One, Benito Mussolini had been held captive in this like Gran Sasso hotel, and Skorzeny was sent like under the cover of darkness with a squad of SS commandos where they like paraglided in with these planes, and within like 5 minutes they deactivated all these Italians and took Mussolini back to Hitler in Berlin. And Hitler supposedly was like disgusted by how broken and everything Mussolini was at this point. So that was the thing that earned Skorzeny like his first medal from Hitler. Well, fast forward to the Eastern Front falling apart for the Nazis, and the Hungarians, I think, were about to ally with the Soviets. And this guy, Miklos Horthy, was going to basically ally with Stalin, and that was going to be crippling to Hitler on the Eastern Front. So he sent Skorzeny to kidnap Miklos Horthy's son and bring him back to Berlin as a political prisoner so that Horthy would abdicate in favor of a Nazi ally. And that is what happened. And then Skorzeny got his second medal from Hitler. The third thing Skorzeny was supposed to do was basically do the same type of thing that the Ritchie Boys were doing, sabotage with basically pretending to be US Army soldiers, and they were going to deliver a bomb to Eisenhower. But that plot was identified and didn't happen, thankfully. But those were like his big three accomplishments. Anyway, this Omahan Paul Krauss identified Skorzeny in this big group of prisoners of war after the war was over. And there was an article that basically mischaracterized how Skorzeny was identified. So my grandpa clarified for the World Herald. Mr. Frohman said that he was one of the, a quiet-spoken Omaha businessman Saturday broke a 7-year silence to tell of his World War II capture of Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's daredevil commando. The Omahan's Paul Krauss. He is now, his former officer, Warner Frohman, tipped off the World Herald. Mr. Frohman said he was one of the first officers to interrogate the 6'4", 235-pound Reich officer after his capture. He decided to reveal the real story after seeing a picture of Skorzeny in the World Herald April 14th. So Paul Krauss got to keep the letter that Skorzeny had on him from Hitler, and my grandpa, they interrogated him and whatnot. So I found that to be a pretty interesting story. There's a picture of Skorzeny. You can see how evil he looks and imposing. So my grandpa got a Bronze Star for his service, and some of the main citation basically reads, First Lieutenant Frohman was responsible for the tabulation and interrogation of over 54,000 prisoners of war who were processed through the cage during the period of the 4th of April to the 5th of May, 1945, so like a month. Often working under exceedingly difficult conditions due to the rapidity of our advance and the large numbers of prisoners taken, Lieutenant Frohman performed his duties in an outstanding manner. He was able to keep the AC of this division continuously informed of enemy units facing the 3rd Infantry Division, of the strength, composition, movements, intentions, and morale of those troops. This became increasingly difficult as the German armed forces disintegrated, but Lieutenant Frohman's untiring efforts and superior knowledge made it possible to present an accurate and comprehensive picture throughout the period. On numerous occasions, Lieutenant Frohman was able to furnish tactical information of great value to the AC of SG2. The speedy tabulation and counting of thousands of prisoners of war, due largely to Lieutenant Frohman's skill and energy, materially contributed to their control and rapid evacuation. And then he got an oak leaf cluster to the Bronze Star as well. So he was lucky. In the interview, you would have heard him say that at the end of the war, they didn't know if they'd be sent from Europe to the South Pacific because the war had not fully been completed. And but he was lucky. He was able to go from Austria to Paris. It says at the top second line, left 3rd Division for Paris, Ribbentrop's Mercedes. That was the foreign affairs minister, like the Secretary of State for the Nazi army. My grandpa got to take his Mercedes to Paris, I guess, and went to Camp Lucky Strike, where he was there for I think a few days, and then got on the Westbrook Victory, a ship, and was sent back to Boston. And this is a summary of the war that he included in here. It's the total prisoners of war captured, and he has it broken out by time period, and then in parentheses sort of where he was between France, Germany, and Austria. And the total was 127,030 prisoners of war captured. And then total combat days broken down by month was 233. And as many of you probably know, after the war, he went into the cattle business, which was his family's business in Germany going back a very long time. And I thought that this was just a great way to encapsulate soldier to cattleman and the Jeep and a really handsome guy who I'm very proud of. And anyways, it's a great triumphant story. I'm really privileged to have been able to share this with you and that you all were interested in this, and be happy to answer any questions that you might have.